You wake before dawn, though the sky has never truly been dark. The smoke from last night's fire still clings to the rafters, drifting in slow ribbons above you, thick enough to taste. Your bed is straw. Your blanket smells faintly of turnip soup. And somewhere under the floorboards, a rat is already having breakfast. Congratulations, you've survived the night, in a 14th century village. Now comes the hard part, surviving the day, and more specifically, surviving what passes for food. The morning doesn't start with a fragrance of roasted beans or buttered bread. It starts with the sound of a pot being stirred, a slow, sticky scrape of wood against iron. Pottage. Always pottage. It's been simmering for so long that no one remembers when it began, a permanent stew that accepts whatever life provides. A carrot if you're lucky, a scrap of bacon if your neighbor's pig died of something not too suspicious. You eat it because there's nothing else, and because hunger doesn't wait for flavor. You ladle out a portion into a wooden bowl, cracked around the rim, polished smooth by years of scraping. Steam rises, carrying the faint smell of boiled onion and despair. You blow on it, take a bite, and immediately regret it. It's both too hot and somehow cold in the middle. But it fills the stomach, and that's the only qualification that matters. In this world, meals aren't meant to be enjoyed. They're meant to keep you upright until nightfall. There's bread too, if you can call it that. A small, heavy loaf baked 3 days ago, made from barley and whatever the miller could stretch it with, ground peas, mashed acorns, sometimes even powdered bark. Wheat is for the rich. You gnaw at the crust and wonder if your teeth will surrender before the loaf does. It's dense, bitter, and faintly sour from the starter that's been reused so often it probably remembers your great-grandfather. Still, it's bread, and bread is life, or at least a form of it. You reach for something to drink. But water is not your friend. The stream looks clear, but so did the one where your cousin caught that unfortunate illness last summer, the one that made him see angels for 3 days and then see nothing at all. So you drink ale instead, small beer, weak, flat, slightly sour, and mercifully safer than the water. It doesn't taste good, but it doesn't kill you either. Children drink it, the elderly drink it, even the priest drinks it, though he swears it's purely medicinal. In the Middle Ages, sobriety is a modern luxury. Breakfast, if that's what we're calling this, leaves you neither full nor happy. It simply happens to you. You wipe the bowl clean with a thumb, lick the thumb clean with a sigh, and prepare for work. Food has done its job, not to comfort, not to delight, but to delay starvation for another few hours. The day passes in labor. You dig, haul, weed, or thresh, each task pulling calories from your body faster than you can replace them. By midday, hunger claws at you again, but there's no proper lunch break, no packed sandwich waiting under a tree. You carry a bit of bread in your pouch, maybe an onion or a chunk of cheese, if fortune smiled yesterday. You eat standing, back bent, the taste of soil mixing with salt and sweat. Everything you consume seems to contain a little of the earth, because it does. Sometimes, if the harvest was kind and no lordly tax collector has emptied your stores, you might have meat. A strip of bacon so salted it could probably outlive you, sliced thin and fried over the fire until it curls like parchment. Or maybe a pigeon, snared behind the barn and roasted whole, bones and all. You eat quickly before anyone sees, because technically that pigeon belongs to your lord, and so do you. Poaching, after all, is not a dietary preference. It's a crime. When there is no meat, there are beans. When there are no beans, there are roots. Turnips, parsnips, leeks, the holy trinity of medieval misery. You boil them until they surrender, mash them into submission, and season with hope. Salt, when available, is precious enough to lock away. Pepper is a rumor from the east. Thou wud remober from the east. Garlic, though common, is viewed with suspicion pungent peasant food, believed by some to warm the blood too much or invite sinful appetite. You eat it anyway, because fear of hunger beats fear of superstition. As you chew through the afternoon, your stomach plays its usual trick, full for 5 minutes, empty for the next 5 hours. Energy is not a resource you own. It's borrowed from the next meal you haven't yet earned. You dream of feasts, of tables with more than one dish, of white bread soft enough to tear with your hands. But dreams don't feed you. Reality does, reluctantly. By evening, the fire smolders low and you gather again for supper, a generous term for reheated leftovers. The same pot still sits by the hearth, its contents darker now, thicker, a living archive of dinners past. Someone adds water, stirs, tastes, shrugs, pottage again. But ids bekain again that the mine so firstery, the 700 founds all. Maybe the taste has improved. Maybe your standards have simply died. Either way, you eat in silence, spoons clinking against wood, the only warmth coming from the fire and the bodies pressed close around it. Outside, the wind smells of manure and rain. Inside, it smells of smoke, onions, and a faint sweetness, the smell of barley drying, of survival simmering one day at a time. Children fall asleep before finishing their bowls, heads resting against their mother's sleeves. An old man coughs, mutters a prayer, and stares into the fire like it might answer. Someone laughs softly about a rumor of a traveling baker who makes bread as white as snow. No one believes it, but the idea alone feels like a feast. Food, in your world, is not just sustenance. It is rhythm, a slow drumbeat that marks the passing of days. When it fails, people die. When it succeeds, people live just long enough to face it again tomorrow. There's no waste, no luxury, no choice. Every crumb has a purpose. Every seed is guarded like treasure. And still, the hunger never truly leaves. It just sleeps beside you, breathing quietly, waiting for morning. Some nights, when the air is still and the fire burns low, you can smell the Lord's manna on the hill. Roasted meat, herbs, fresh bread. The scent drifts down like a cruel blessing, reminding you that even hunger is ranked by class. You close your eyes and pretend your bowl of turnip stew is something grander. You imagine spice, butter, salt. You imagine choice. But when you wake, it will be the same pot, the same crust, the same battle between need and hope. So you eat your final spoonful, stretch your aching limbs, and settle back into straw that prickles through the blanket. Your stomach feels heavy, but not satisfied. Outside, a dog barks, then quiets. The village hums its tired lullaby, creaking wood, soft breathing, the slow hiss of dying embers. Tomorrow will bring another bowl, another chew, another day where survival tastes faintly of onions and ash. And somehow, that will be enough. Winter is the enemy that never truly leaves. Even in spring, its shadow lingers in the cellar. You can taste it in the grain that went slightly damp, in the carrots that have gone soft around the edges, in the faint sourness of the butter that should have been eaten weeks ago. Every peasant knows this rhythm. Feast in the harvest months, famine in the hungry gap, when last year's stores rot faster than the new crops grow. It's not starvation in one grand act, but a slow thinning of life, like a candle burning down too soon. By February, the pottage grows pale and watery. The barley barrel stands half empty. The bread is stretched with ground beans that make it gray and bitter. Children cry at night not from illness, but from the echo of hunger that never quite stops. You learn to chew slowly, to pretend fullness, to dream of fields turning green again. And when Lent arrives demanding fasting in the name of piety, you smile quietly as if there were anything left to give up. When spring finally pushes through the mud, it brings its own dangers. Fresh greens appear, nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, and you gather them greedily, though half the village can't tell the safe plants from the ones that burn your stomach for days. Still, the first bite of something new tastes like a miracle. You chew it raw in the field, the juice sharp and alive on your tongue. For a moment, it almost feels like hope. On market day, the village stirs earlier than usual. Carts creak, coins clink, chickens protest their fate. The air smells of yeast, manure, and human breath. You trade what you have: eggs, wool, maybe a jar of honey if the bees were kind. In return, you might buy a bit of salt, a lump of cheese, or a handful of dried peas to see you through another week. Everything costs more than it should, because hunger raises prices faster than any lord can. But you still linger at the baker's stall, inhaling the smell of fresh loaves you can't afford. It's a kind of torture, but also a reminder the world is larger than your hut, even if you rarely see it. The wealthiest merchant in the market sells spice. Not to you, of course. To nobles, monks, and anyone with a purse fat enough to buy flavor. You glance at the tiny cone of pepper, the dusting of saffron, the shards of cinnamon that came from a world so far away you might as well call it heaven. One pinch could buy you a month of barley. The smell alone makes you dizzy. You wonder what it must be like to live in a world where taste itself is a luxury. When summer comes, it's both relief and punishment. The days are long, the fields demanding. You bend for hours under the sun, scythe swinging, back screaming. Sweat mixes with dust and sticks to your skin until you taste salt every time you lick your lips. But there's food now. Real food. Fresh peas, soft bread from the new grain, even fruit if the birds haven't claimed it first. You eat too quickly, as though the bounty might vanish between one swallow and the next. And in a way, it will. Insects come. Rain spoils the grain. Mice chew through the storehouse. The world always finds a way to take its share. In good years, the village celebrates the harvest with bread shaped like suns and crosses. It's part prayer, part superstition. You thank the saints, the soil, the weather. Anything that might be listening, a jug of ale passes around, a fiddle starts up, and for one night everyone forgets the taste of fear. Laughter mingles with smoke, and the glow of torches turns the fields golden again. But even in joy, there's caution. No one eats too freely. The past has taught you that every full stomach is borrowed time. The diet changes with the seasons, but never enough to call it variety. In autumn, you live on grains and apples. In winter, turnips and hope. In spring, herbs and luck. By midsummer, the repetition numbs you, the same bowl, the same chew, the same prayer. You don't crave sweetness or spice anymore. You crave certainty, the comfort of knowing that tomorrow there will still be something in the pot. Disease walks hand in hand with hunger. When the crops fail, people eat what they shouldn't. Moldy grain, strange mushrooms, even grass boiled into thin soup. They call it necessity. The body calls it poison. Some fall ill with fevers, others with visions. A neighbor starts shouting nonsense one evening, swears she can see demons dancing in the smoke. By morning she's dead, her mouth stained dark from the bread she baked the night before. The priest calls it God's punishment. The wise woman calls it bad rye. You call it terrifying. In years like that, the village remembers the famine songs. Old verses sung in low voices about mothers sharing crusts, about winters where even bark was precious. The songs aren't meant to entertain. They're warnings, reminders of how thin the line is between living and disappearing. And yet they're strangely comforting too, because if your ancestors survived, maybe you will too. You hum the tune while stirring the pot, letting the rhythm fill the silence between hunger and hope. Sometimes when the sky turns pink and the fields smell of hay, you imagine another life, one where you eat when you're hungry, drink when you're thirsty, and taste things just because they're good. You can't picture it clearly. It feels like a fairy tale told by someone who's never been cold. Still, the thought lingers, quiet as smoke. By the firelight, your family finishes the day's meal. Children lick their bowls clean, mothers scrape the pot for tomorrow's starter. Outside, the wind carries the smell of cut grain and distant rain. Inside, someone mutters a prayer for the next harvest. It's not said with hope or despair, but with routine, the kind that keeps you sane. You lie back, close your eyes, and listen to your stomach settle. You are full for now, and that's the closest thing to peace this world allows. The night deepens. Somewhere, an owl cries. The pot by the hearth still steams faintly, ready to begin the slow simmer of another day. You drift toward sleep, thinking of bread, of fields, of the fragile quiet between hunger and harvest. And for a few hours at least, you dream of plenty. Hunger changes you. It makes you cautious, polite, and strangely reverent toward things you once ignored. A crust of bread becomes holy. A pot of stew becomes a promise. Even the hum of boiling water feels alive, whispering that survival is still possible for one more day. The church says fasting cleanses the soul. You already feel clean enough, hollow, almost transparent. But rules are rules, and faith governs your stomach as much as your conscience. No meat on Fridays, no indulgence during Lent, no feasting without reason. On paper, fasting brings you closer to God. In practice, it's just another form of hunger with better public relations. Fish replaces meat when you can find it. Salted herring, dried so stiff you have to hammer it before cooking. Sometimes eels, writhing in barrels from the coast, their eyes gone cloudy but still watching. You boil them with onions, pretending it's a feast, and swallow quickly before you remember what they looked like alive. Inland villages without rivers improvise. They eat whatever crawls, swims, or vaguely resembles obedience to church law. Frogs, snails, even beaver tails, which monks once declared fish on a technicality. Faith, like appetite, can be flexible. You wonder about the people who make these rules. The abbots who dine behind monastery walls on bread, white as clouds, washing it down with wine from their own vines. They fast too, of course, but fasting in a place full of food is easier than fasting in a place full of silence. You don't resent them, not exactly. You just wonder how it must feel to choose hunger instead of having it choose you. There are other forbidden foods, not by God, but by circumstance. Things that could feed you if the law allowed it. Deer in the forest, geese by the pond, apples from the Lord's orchard. They're close enough to smell and yet untouchable, guarded by the invisible fence of class. If you're caught taking one, it's theft. If the Lord takes 10, it's tradition. So you look away, chew your gray bread, and let your stomach argue quietly with your sense of justice. Even what you can eat feels uncertain. Every loaf carries a hint of danger. Mold hides in the grain. Ergot fungus blackens the rye. You've seen what it does. The trembling hands, the strange laughter, the skin that burns as though touched by fire. The priest calls it possession. The healer calls it cursed grain. You call it another reason to pray before every bite. Children learn early what not to eat. It can create. Mushrooms are tested on dogs first. Berries are watched to see what the birds choose. If they avoid them, so do you. Even milk can turn on you if the cow's been sick or the pail left too long in the sun. Every meal is a gamble played against the elements: mold, rot, insects, and time. You win by not dying. But there are days when fortune softens. Feast days, weddings, harvest festivals, brief, bright exceptions where food becomes more than fuel. The village gathers and the smell of roasting fills the air. Someone has brewed strong ale. Someone else is turning a spit with what might actually be meat. Children laugh. Men boast. Women sneak extra salt into the pot when no one's watching. You eat until the tightness in your chest loosens and the noise of the world feels kind again. Then, when it's over, silence returns like winter. Hunger is not just absence, it's presence. It teaches patience, humility, faith. You learn to listen to the body's small complaints, the hollow ache, the lightheaded calm that arrives after hours without food. You learn to make peace with craving, to see it as a familiar companion instead of an enemy. After all, hunger is proof of life. The dead do not hunger. At night, you sit by the hearth and watch the last ember fade. Your hands smell of smoke and soil, your breath of onion and beer. Outside, the moon hangs low and indifferent. You think about tomorrow's meal, though you know exactly what it will be. Still, imagination is its own kind of nourishment. You picture bread as soft as clouds, fruit that drips with sweetness, a world where food is comfort instead of challenge. You smile faintly at the thought. Dreams cost nothing, and they fill the heart better than pottage ever could. The air cools. Someone stirs in their sleep. The fire sighs and settles. And as your eyes close, the scent of boiled grain and wood smoke wraps around you like a blanket. It isn't luxury. It isn't peace. But it's life. Fragile, persistent, quietly heroic. You drift off knowing that, come morning, you'll wake to the same hunger, the same work, the same gray stew, and somehow you'll still call it breakfast. By late autumn, the air thickens with the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. The fields stand empty, shorn to stubble, and the granaries echo faintly when you step inside. You can feel the year folding in on itself, another circle of work and waiting. There's a comfort in the repetition, even when the hunger never fully leaves. It's the rhythm of survival, as steady as breath. You sit by the hearth, stirring what's left in the pot. The fire spits softly, catching on the resin in the logs. Outside, frost creeps along the window frame, thin white fingers tracing the end of the season. You taste the stew one last time before bed. It's bland, smoky, familiar. You don't love it, but you trust it. In a world where so much can go wrong, a meal that simply fills the silence feels almost divine. In the distance, a bell tolls from the manor chapel. You can almost imagine the sound of laughter carried on the wind, the Lord's household dining late, where the tables shine with silver and the food glitters with spice. It feels like another world entirely, separated not by distance, but by fate. You wonder what it would be like to eat without fear, to dine because you can, not because you must. But the thought drifts away, quiet as the smoke above the fire. Your eyes grow heavy. Tomorrow will taste the same. Barley, onion, salt, if you're lucky. Yet in the faint warmth of the dying embers, something like peace settles in. You have endured another day, another meal, another winter creeping closer, and for now, that is enough. The night deepens. The fire sighs once more, and somewhere beyond the dark fields, another kind of feast is beginning, one with music, candles, and danger hiding behind the gold. Somewhere above the fields, beyond the thatched roofs and the quiet churn of smoke, another fire burns, brighter, louder, untroubled by hunger. You can see it from the edge of the village if the night is clear enough. The distant shimmer of torchlight dancing on stone walls, the faint hum of music carried down the hill like perfume. That is not your world, though it governs yours. It is the Lord's hall, where supper is not survival but spectacle. Inside, the air glows amber. The hearth roars so hot that even the flagstones seem to sweat. The hall smells of roasted meat, melting fat, and warm ale, a fragrance so thick it clings to your throat. Wooden tables stretch end to end beneath a ceiling, lost in shadow, and every inch of them groans under platters, glazed birds, golden pies, fruits sugared until they sparkle like jewels. This is where hunger goes to die, and vanity is reborn as cuisine. But the luxury has its own danger. In the Middle Ages, a noble's table is not merely a place to eat. It is a stage, a negotiation, and sometimes a battlefield dressed in silken gravy. Every dish tells a story of wealth and power, and every bite carries a risk. Tonight, the guests arrive wrapped in velvet and self-importance. They bow to their host, praise the musicians, and glance sideways to see who's seated higher. Hierarchy matters here even more than appetite. A misplaced fork, a wrong word, a toast raised at the wrong moment. Any of these can spoil more than the meal. You dine not just to feed your body, but to feed your image. And in this glittering hall of rivalry and roasted pheasant, appearances are everything. So as the servants pour wine and the first course steams before you, you smile, you nod, you taste, and you hope that what looks like luxury isn't laced with something far less elegant. The noise in the great hall rises like the tide, a slow rhythmic swell of laughter, clinking goblets, and the scrape of knives on pewter. The light flickers on the walls, alive with shadows that move like ghosts caught mid-dance. You sit at the long table, heart steady but cautious. To feast in a noble hall is not comfort, it is theater. And you, like everyone else, are on stage. A servant appears at your side, head bowed low, holding a silver basin of warm water. You dip your fingers in and dry them on linen, embroidered with your host's crest. Clean hands are a luxury here, not a habit. The scent of rosemary hides the faint tang of sweat and smoke that never truly leaves the air. The ritual feels civilized, though the floor beneath your boots is littered with bones and breadcrumbs, the silent reminder that even grandeur has a mess it prefers to ignore. The first course arrives, roasted peacock. Its blue feathers have been reattached after cooking, fanned proudly like a shimmering crown, because beauty is worth more than taste. The meat itself is stringy and tough, but that hardly matters. You eat with your eyes first, and in the Middle Ages, eyes are everything. Beside it, a swan, its neck curved in eternal grace, skin brushed with gold leaf, eyes replaced by black pearls. It smells faintly sweet from the honey glaze, though the sweetness can't quite mask the bitterness underneath. Someone jokes that the swan is almost too beautiful to eat. No one laughs loudly. Humor here is always an experiment. You glance down the table. Servants pour wine that glows ruby in the firelight, claret from Gascony, imported at staggering cost. It smells faintly of spice and smoke, a liquid boast. Your goblet is never allowed to empty. Your stomach, however, is not the main concern. In a medieval banquet, the point is not to eat until full, but to be seen eating well. Each bite is an act of performance. Each gesture a line in the unwritten play of social grace. Conversation hums around you, low, measured, and sharp-edged. The knight across the table speaks too loudly about his latest victory, pausing often for admiration that arrives slower than he hopes. A lady in green silk smiles, then glances away just before her husband notices. Politics lives in every glance. Even the carver, slicing meat before the Lord, performs with ceremonial precision, each motion a small declaration of loyalty. To dine here is to navigate danger with a spoon and a smile. And yet, for all the splendor, the food itself can betray you. The kitchens below are hot, frantic, and barely clean. Servants rush between smoke-blackened cauldrons and open flames, where oxen turn slowly on spits the size of trees. Sauces bubble thick with wine, vinegar, and herbs meant less to flavor the meat than to disguise that it's begun to turn. Salt is precious, refrigeration a dream centuries away. To eat richly in the Middle Ages is to gamble with your intestines and your pride. The richer the dish, the greater the risk. Poison, too, lingers in the imagination of every nobleman, not often real, but always possible. A dash too much of something bitter, a taste that doesn't belong. Your mind turns it over with every swallow, especially when the wine feels warm on the tongue. Poison was the invisible weapon of power, silent, elegant, and deniable. More than one noble has fallen ill after dining in company and been buried before the truth cooled. You smile politely and sip again anyway. Suspicion, like salt, sharpens the flavor of everything. The musicians begin their song, lutes and fiddles, weaving a tune too cheerful for the hour. Pages bring out another course, pies, the size of shields. Inside, not apples or berries, but meat, minced, spiced, and bound with fat. One pie opens to reveal a surprise, a flock of small birds that flutter briefly toward the ceiling before the laughter follows them. It's not meant to be practical. It's meant to impress. Food here isn't for eating. It's for storytelling. Somewhere near the high table, the Lord himself leans back in his chair, his fur-trimmed robe pooling around him like a small kingdom. He laughs loudly, a man who knows that everyone laughs when he does. His wife sits beside him, composed, beautiful, and calculating. She touches her cup but does not drink. A single bead of wine trembles at the rim, reflecting the firelight like a drop of blood. No one dares ask why. You wonder what happens to all this food, the half-eaten roasts, the crusts untouched by soft hands. Later, some of it will trickle down to the servants, then to the poor waiting by the gate, bowls in hand, hoping for scraps. The feast that began in excess will end in charity, and everyone will praise the Lord's generosity. That's how the system works. Gluttony disguised as virtue, hunger repackaged as grace. The air grows heavier as the night deepens. Candles gutter low and smoke curls toward the beams, thick and lazy. The laughter softens into murmurs. Someone begins a story, a night, a monster, a quest, half remembered, half imagined. Even the nobles crave escape, it seems, from their gilded discomfort. You listen, half dazed by warmth and wine, until the words blur into rhythm. For a brief moment, it almost feels peaceful. Then someone coughs, a rough, wet sound that cuts through the music like a crack in glass. All eyes turn, but the man only smiles weakly, lifting his cup in apology. The musicians resume, but the air feels different now, less golden, more uncertain. Feasts end, as all things do, with silence and regret. By midnight, the tables are stripped bare, bones swept to the dogs, wax pooled on the stone. The guests drift away, drunk on wine and pride. In the corner, a servant gathers the remains into a wooden trough, tomorrow's pottage for the lower halls. Nothing goes to waste, not in this world. You step outside into the cold. The stars hang motionless above the dark fields. From here, the village looks small, almost invisible, a cluster of sleeping lives unaware of the banquet's grandeur or its hidden rot. The air smells of frost and smoke, of endings. You breathe deeply and think, for a fleeting second, that maybe the peasants have it right after all. At least their hunger is honest. Behind you, the great hall glows faintly through the fog, a lantern of warmth in a world that's mostly cold. But even that warmth, you realize, comes at a cost. Because in the Middle Ages, food isn't just food. It's faith, power, danger, and theater, and everyone, no matter their station, is an actor in the same hungry play. Below the hall, the air changes. It's thicker here, a stew of smoke, steam, and human breath that never fully leaves. The kitchen is alive in its own way, a breathing organism of fire, noise, and exhaustion. You hear the muffled thud of cleavers, the hiss of dripping fat on coals, the quiet curses of cooks moving too quickly to be seen. If the Great Hall is a theater, this is the engine room, hidden, necessary, and perpetually on the edge of collapse. The servants move like ghosts through the heat, barefoot, soot-faced, sleeves rolled high. They speak little, except to warn of a spill or a burn. Every sound is part of the same rhythm. The clatter of ladles, the rustle of flour, the sharp pop of sap in the firewood. One wrong move, one dropped platter, one overcooked bird, and you're out of favor, out of work, maybe out of shelter by morning. The stakes are high here, even when the reward is only another day's exhaustion. The cook, a man with arms like oak trunks, tastes the sauce with a wooden spoon. He frowns, adds more vinegar, mutters something about the meat being tired. He doesn't mean spoiled, though it probably is. He means it has lived too long in the storeroom. In this world, time itself is the enemy of taste. Without ice or clean preservation, every dish is a negotiation with decay. You don't cook to make food delicious. You cook to make it safe enough to swallow. Behind him, a girl grinds spices with a pestle, cinnamon, ginger, clove, the scent thick and dizzying. Each grain worth more than her week's wage. She doesn't dare sneeze. These spices come from worlds she's never imagined, carried by ship and camel and coin, through deserts she'll never see. She knows they'll go not into her mouth, but into the Lord's. That's how the world works here. The poor grind what the rich taste. In the corner, a boy stirs a pot too big for him. The stew bubbles with cuts of meat that would shame a butcher. Ears, tongues, and scraps boiled past recognition. It smells better than it looks. He doesn't complain. He knows that later, when the nobles have finished, this same stew will become his dinner, watered down, cooled, and ladled into bowls behind the kitchen door. It's the closest thing to equality this household will ever know. A baker kneads dough by the oven, his arms white with flour, his face glistening with sweat. He's been awake since before dawn, feeding the fire, watching for cracks in the crust. The bread here is different. White, soft, almost weightless. The lords demand purity in their flour, a kind of edible vanity. But even white bread has its secrets. It's made with the same grain as the peasants, sifted and bleached, the waste cast aside like ash. For every loaf that reaches the high table, another 3 are thrown to the dogs. The irony doesn't go unnoticed. In a quiet corner, a servant steals a mouthful of dripping, the fat left to cool beneath a roast. He wipes his fingers quickly, glances around, and grins. For him, that taste is luxury itself. It's a moment of rebellion, small and satisfying, swallowed before guilt can find it. Even in the lowest ranks, food is power, and power, however brief, tastes sweet. When the feast above grows loud again, a signal drum sounds. More dishes are carried upward, whole boars with apples in their mouths, pies sealed with wax, jellied fish sculpted into shapes of saints. The smell that rises with them is almost holy, a kind of edible incense drifting through the floorboards. But no one in the kitchen looks up. They're already preparing for tomorrow's meal. In a world without rest, appetite is endless. As the night wears on, the kitchen cools. The fire shrinks to embers. Servants lean against the walls, too tired to speak. They've fed 100 mouths and eaten almost nothing themselves. A girl hums a low tune, something old, something from a village she hasn't seen in years. It sounds like longing, not for wealth, not even for comfort, just for food she could eat slowly, without fear, without orders. Bread baked for taste, not for show. Above them, the noble hall is silent now. The torches burn low. The guests have stumbled off to their chambers, bellies heavy, minds fogged with wine. Somewhere, a dog gnaws a discarded bone. The echo of laughter still clings to the beams, faint and ghost. The table, once crowded with splendor, is a battlefield of crumbs and stains. The feast has ended, but its shadow remains, hunger dressed in gold. Tomorrow, there will be another banquet. A wedding, a treaty, a victory, any excuse will do. And once again the kitchen will wake before dawn, the servants will sweat, and the nobles will pretend the world is kind. The cycle will repeat until the lords grow sick, the fields grow bare, or the cooks themselves fall to hunger. Because even in a hall of plenty, scarcity is always lurking, silent, invisible, patient. The night outside is cold again. The stars above the castle are the same ones that shine over the peasants' huts far below, the same constellations, the same wind, the same hunger, only dressed differently. For some, in rags. For others, in velvet. When the last ember fades in the hearth, the hall finally exhales. The torches sputter, the tapestries sway in the draught, and the night swallows the music that once filled these walls. All that remains is the smell, that dense mingled perfume of smoke, spice, and sweet decay that no amount of washing can erase. It clings to the stone, to the silver, to the memories of those who dined too well for their own good. Somewhere in the shadows, a servant gathers the final scraps from the table. Bits of pastry, a sliver of swan, a drop of wine left in a goblet. The silence around him feels almost reverent. Above, the Lord sleeps soundly, dreaming of banners and power, while his cook lies awake, counting debts and burns. Both will rise hungry in the morning, though not for the same things. The feast has ended, but the danger never really leaves. It lingers in the food, in the politics, in the unspoken fear that tomorrow's luxury might become tomorrow's illness. Even pleasure here carries a price, and as the castle drifts into uneasy quiet, the earth beyond its walls lies waiting, fields full of grain, humble, unguarded, and far more powerful than the gold that tries to own them. Because in the end, all nobility depends on bread, and sometimes that bread turns against them all. It starts with bread. Simple, innocent, ordinary bread. The kind that holds the world together. The kind you'd tear apart without thinking, soak in stew, feed to a child. But in some medieval villages, that same bread turned strange. People began to twitch and shake. Their fingers curled like claws. Some claimed to see angels. Others swore they saw fire raining from the sky. And by morning, the entire village was whispering the same word, cursed. It wasn't magic. Not demons, not divine punishment. It was something far smaller, a fungus that hid in the rye. Invisible, patient, and perfectly at home in damp fields after a long cold spring. Its name was ergot, though the peasants never called it that. They just called it the black grain or the devil's dust. It blended in easily. Dark, slender, easy to miss until it was too late. And when ground into flour, baked into bread, and shared around a table, it carried something far more powerful than hunger or faith. The symptoms came quietly at first. A tingling in the fingers, a burning under the skin. Then pain, deep, relentless like fire crawling through the veins. Hands and feet turned cold, then black. Some lost them entirely, as if the body had decided to discard what it could no longer save. Others fell into strange trances, laughing, singing, speaking in tongues no one understood. In some villages, entire families convulsed together, writhing on the floorboards, while priests poured holy water over them in terror. They called it Saint Anthony's fire, a holy name for a very earthly poison. In the countryside of France, the stories spread faster than the plague. Monks wrote of pilgrims crawling to the shrine of Saint Anthony, begging for relief from the burning. Some arrived barefoot, their toes already gone. Others carried the limbs of relatives in cloth, as offerings. The monks didn't understand what caused it, but they noticed something odd. When they fed the sick pilgrims bread made from wheat instead of rye, the symptoms faded. They called it a miracle. It was, in a way, a scientific one, centuries too early to be recognized. In other parts of Europe, the same madness appeared again and again, always after wet seasons. In one village, people danced uncontrollably for days, laughing until they collapsed. In another, they saw visions, serpents in the sky, demons in the river, angels walking through the smoke of their chimneys. Superstition bloomed as fast as the mold itself. Priests blamed witches. Witches blamed sin. Farmers blamed the weather. And the weather, as always, said nothing. You imagine it now, a quiet morning, gray mist rising over the fields, the miller grinding the rye, the flour falling soft and fragrant, carrying death like a secret. A woman kneading dough with her bare hands, humming a hymn she half remembers. The oven warm, the crust turning brown, the smell comforting, familiar, safe. A loaf cooling on a wooden board while the children wait for their share. No one suspects a thing, and yet by nightfall the world bends sideways. Laughter becomes screaming, faith becomes panic, and bread becomes something else entirely. Some called it divine punishment for gluttony. Others thought it a test from God, separating the pure from the wicked. But in truth, it was just nature, indifferent, efficient, and cruelly creative. A small organism teaching humanity that survival doesn't always mean safety. And still, they ate, because what else could they do? The bread was all they had. You cannot starve on purpose when you've already known real hunger. So they chewed and prayed and hoped their turn would never come. The ergot fungus thrived on fear. It needed only moisture, darkness, and a little ignorance, all plentiful in medieval Europe. In wet years, it devoured fields. In dry years, it slept, waiting for the next rain. It didn't care for kings or peasants. It infected them all. Even monasteries weren't safe. Bread for the Holy Mass sometimes carried the same curse, turning communion, that sacred ritual of the body, into a slow descent into pain and visions. Imagine the confusion, the guilt. Believers thinking God Himself had entered them, when in truth it was a chemical reaction unfolding quietly in their blood. Centuries later, scientists would realize that ergot contains alkaloids, the same compounds that would one day inspire modern medicine and LSD. The hallucinations that haunted entire towns weren't divine. They were chemical. Some historians even whisper that the famous witch trials in Salem centuries later might have begun with a bad harvest of rye. Young girls convulsing, seeing demons, blaming neighbors, all sparked perhaps by the same invisible grain that once burned through medieval Europe, a fungus shaping history one loaf at a time. But in the 14th century, no one knew that. They only knew that sometimes the bread betrayed them, that the same hands that fed their children might also be the cause of their suffering, and that no prayer, no potion, no physician could draw the fire out once it began. When your food turns against you, you learn to fear the familiar. You start to question the smell of flour, the color of dough, the sound of your own stomach. And that kind of fear lingers. Not loud, but deep. It changes how you see every meal thereafter. For centuries, St. Anthony's fire smoldered quietly through Europe's memory. Villages rebuilt, crops rotated, and the sickness seemed to fade. Until the next wet season, the next hungry year, the next desperate harvest. And even after the cause was forgotten, the stories remained. The sermons warning against gluttony, the tales of cursed bakers, the fear of bread that looked too dark. Superstition filled the silence science had yet to reach. Because people need reasons, even when the truth is simply damp grain and bad luck. You can almost smell it now. The faint sourness of rye dough, the musty scent of mold hiding beneath the crust. You picture a family breaking the loaf open, steam curling into the cold air, hands reaching, mouths trusting. And beneath that quiet, domestic gesture lies the oldest horror of all, that the thing meant to keep you alive might be the very thing that takes you apart. When the burning began, people didn't run to the doctor. They ran to the church. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a gamble. Faith at least promised meaning. Those who could still walk made pilgrimages to the shrines of St. Anthony, the patron of those afflicted by the mysterious fire. Some crawled on their knees, others carried the limbs they'd lost, wrapped in cloth-like relics. The air around those shrines was thick with incense and hope, and the faint metallic scent of wounds trying to heal. The monks there were known as the Hospitallers of St. Anthony. They didn't know what caused the sickness, but they treated its symptoms with a mixture of kindness and ritual. They shaved the heads of the afflicted, anointed them with oil, and fed them pure wheat bread from the monastery's own fields. To the desperate, it felt miraculous. The burning stopped, the visions faded, fingers slowly regained color. The pilgrims called it divine mercy. The monks called it faith. Science would later call it an accidental experiment in food safety. Those who recovered often left behind the things that had once defined them. A farmer who could no longer hold a plow, a mother who had buried half her family, a child too afraid to touch bread again. Some stayed at the monasteries permanently, working the gardens, milking the goats, trying to repay salvation with labor. They moved slowly, as if the fire still lived under their skin. And maybe it did in memory, if not in flame. The monasteries themselves became sanctuaries not just of healing, but of silence. The monks learned in their quiet way what farmers never had time to notice, that the blackened rye sprouted in damp fields, that the sickness followed wet summers, that bread from dry sunny harvests never burned. They began to store their grain differently, to turn the fields more often, to inspect every kernel before grinding. They didn't write down the pattern, but they remembered it. Knowledge moved slowly back then, carried not by parchment, but by habit. Elsewhere, the fear grew stranger. Villagers who'd survived began to see patterns that weren't there. A patch of black fungus became an omen. A farmer's wife with shaking hands became a witch. Bread itself grew suspicious. Some refused to eat rye altogether, turning instead to barley or oats, safer but poorer. Others whispered that the sickness was contagious, that it traveled through breath or touch. They weren't entirely wrong. In a way, fear itself was contagious. Chroniclers wrote about these outbreaks like plagues of the soul. One from Burgundy in the 1120s tells of villagers dancing until their bones cracked, laughing as they died. Another from the Rhine describes mothers abandoning infants in rivers, believing the water could cool the fire in their blood. Most of these accounts read like nightmares. Too strange, too cruel to be real. And yet, the monks' records and the bones unearthed centuries later say otherwise. There are skeletons with shriveled limbs, charred in appearance but untouched by flame. Bones of famine and fungus, mistaken for holy punishment. Even kings and nobles feared the fire. It didn't care for titles. Banquets with their imported rye flour and poor storage sometimes saw outbreaks among the wealthy too. Not whole castles, just small unsettling moments. A noblewoman trembling during supper, a knight crying out at invisible flames, a priest collapsing mid-sermon, his tongue blackened and dry. When it happened, the cause was never the bread, of course. It was sin, or spirits, or the devil's own hand. The simplest explanation was the hardest to see. In time, people began to associate St. Anthony's fire with divine testing. To survive, it was to be purified. To die from it was to be chosen. The cult of the saint grew, and his symbol, a blue T-shaped cross, became a mark of protection. It was carved into doors, burned into barn beams, painted above bakeries. Faith spread faster than spores. And for many, that faith worked. Not because it killed the fungus, but because it comforted the heart, which in a world without medicine was half the cure already. Centuries later, the monks' practices would quietly fade. The great hospitals of St. Anthony would close, their miracles replaced by science that didn't need saints. But the legend of the burning disease remained. In folklore, in paintings, in whispered prayers before meals. Even today, you can still find carvings of St. Anthony holding a staff, topped with a small bell. A reminder of the nights when those bells rang through Europe, summoning the sick from their beds to walk barefoot towards salvation. Some made it. Most didn't. The fields recovered, though. The rye kept growing. And so did humanity's trust in bread. Cautious, but never broken, because to stop eating would be to stop living, and the Middle Ages were never good at giving up. So they sowed again, ground again, baked again, and when the first warm loaf came out of the oven, steam curling into the dim kitchen light, someone surely smiled. Even if, deep down, they still wondered whether this one might be the last safe bite, the fungus never truly disappeared. It still sleeps in the damp corners of the world, waiting for the right mix of weather and neglect. Modern medicine can kill it, but memory keeps it alive. The echo of all those unseen harvests that ended in madness. And so, every time someone breaks bread, without thinking, without fear, there's a quiet triumph there. A victory so small, it fits in your hand. A rebellion against centuries of hunger and hallucination. You finish your meal, push the crumbs aside, and breathe in the smell of clean, harmless wheat. The world feels stable again. And yet, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The low, distant whisper of a medieval oven door creaking open, a mother calling her children to supper, and the quiet hiss of something hidden, waiting, ancient. Bread was never just food in the Middle Ages. It was the heartbeat of life itself. It marked the difference between famine and plenty, between gratitude and despair. Every loaf came with a kind of reverence, a prayer whispered into dough, a small cross traced in flour before baking. It wasn't superstition, it was habit, muscle memory from generations who'd learned how fragile life could be. To break bread was to make peace. To share, it was to show mercy. Even the poorest table kept a crust aside for travelers, beggars, or the dead. A simple gesture in a world where everything else cost too much. Bread connected people to the earth and to each other. Every bite was a link in a chain that stretched from seed to soil to soul. Perhaps that's why it was so terrifying when bread turned cruel, when it burned, when it killed, when it betrayed the faith people placed in it. The church understood that power. Bread was the center of its holiest ritual, the Eucharist, the transformation of wheat into the body of Christ. Each Mass reminded believers that salvation itself came in the shape of a loaf. To receive it, was to taste eternity, to be momentarily clean in a world of mud and sin. But when that same bread caused illness, the questions were harder to silence. If God's own symbol could carry pain, what else could be trusted? The priests had no answers, only the same bread, baked again, blessed again, eaten again. Faith, like hunger, refused to die. For peasants, bread shaped time. Days began with dough and ended with crumbs. You knew the season by the color of the flour, pale gold in summer, gray in winter. You could taste the weather, the soil, the insects, the labor. Each loaf was a map of survival, baked with the story of the year inside it. Children learned to knead before they could read. The smell of baking marked not celebration, but endurance, a quiet signal that life, for now, continued. In years of famine, people stretched their dough with anything that would hold shape. Ground bark, weeds, crushed peas, even dust. The bread became darker, heavier, harder to chew. Still, they baked. Even a bad loaf was better than no loaf. To throw it away was a sin. To waste grain was an insult to both God and the soil. And so they ate, even when their jaws ached, even when their stomachs turned, because the alternative was emptiness, and emptiness in the Middle Ages had a name: despair. Bread was currency. Taxes could be paid in it. Alliances sealed over it. It fed armies, crowned kings, and started riots. When the price of grain rose too high, cities burned. When it fell, people sang hymns in the streets. The smallest crumb could tip the balance between peace and revolt. No throne, no church, no sword was as powerful as the millstone that ground the grain. And beneath all that history, there was still something deeply human. The warmth of a loaf held in both hands, the crackle of crust, the faint steam rising like a sigh into the morning air. For all their suffering, medieval people still loved that moment. The first bite of bread was the closest they came to certainty. It was humble, honest, alive. Even those who feared it, who remembered the fire in their veins and the screams in their villages, still returned to it in the end. Because to reject bread was to reject life itself. Sometimes, when the harvest failed and the priest prayed for rain, a baker would stand alone in his shop, staring at the empty shelves. He would knead what little he had left, slowly, deliberately, knowing every loaf was a promise, one he might not be able to keep. He would shape the dough, score a cross, and whisper, "Please, not this year." The oven would glow, the smell would fill the street, and for a few minutes, the village would remember what hope tasted like. It's strange how something so ordinary could hold so much power, how it could be both sacred and deadly, both mercy and punishment. Maybe that's why bread has endured, long after the lords and plagues and priests have faded into dust. It carries memory better than stone. It survives in scent and ritual and quiet gratitude, the one universal language of hunger. You picture it now, a loaf cooling on a wooden table, steam curling upward into the cold. Outside, a frost creeps over the fields. Inside, someone breaks the crust and hands it to a child. The child smiles, takes a bite, and the world, just for that moment, feels safe again. No curses, no fire, no fungus. Only warmth and the small, steady heartbeat of survival. The fire in the blood faded with time. The fields healed, the memories softened, and bread became safe again, or at least safe enough to trust. People stopped whispering about curses. The priest stopped warning about sinful harvests. The ovens burned again, clean and bright, filling the air with that familiar scent of survival. In the rhythm of daily life, the horror dissolved into habit, then into legend. And what remained was reverence. Every loaf was still blessed before it was baked. Every crumb still carried a kind of holiness. Not the kind taught in sermons, but the kind learned through endurance, the quiet faith of those who knew how fragile nourishment could be. Even now, centuries later, when we slice bread without thinking, we echo that same ancient gratitude, the relief of living in a world where food no longer turns against us. But in the medieval mind, comfort was never meant to last. Once hunger was conquered, curiosity took its place. If bread could betray, perhaps flavor could redeem. And soon a new obsession began to rise, something glittering, distant, and far more expensive than gold. It began with a scent, a whisper of cinnamon, a spark of pepper, a promise carried across oceans, and from that moment on, the world would never taste the same again. It's hard to imagine craving flavor in a world that barely had enough to eat. But somehow, that's exactly what the Middle Ages did. Out of hunger came obsession, and out of survival came desire. The same people who once feared their own bread began to dream of things they'd never seen. Black pepper, golden saffron, cinnamon that smelled like warmth itself, not just food anymore, but symbols. Spices weren't seasoning. They were salvation, powdered and packed into tiny wooden boxes worth more than gold. Picture the scene. A medieval kitchen after a rare good harvest. The fire glows low, the air thick with smoke, and the earthy scent of boiling meat. Someone sprinkles a few black grains into a pot, the first pepper they've touched in months. It crackles, fragrant and sharp. The smell alone feels like wealth. No one speaks as it spreads through the room, curling into noses, making mouths water. It's not just cooking, it's communion. To taste spice in the Middle Ages was to taste power. Peppercorns came from India, cloves from the distant Moluccas, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, nutmeg from islands most Europeans didn't even know existed. Each one carried the weight of a journey. Caravans through deserts, ships creaking through monsoon seas, merchants whispering in strange languages over scales and coin. By the time they reached a European port, each handful could buy a farm. They were measured by the grain, guarded by armed men, and stored in locked chests alongside jewels. A single pinch in a noble's dish could signal everything: wealth, worldliness, control. The poor seasoned their food with hope. The rich seasoned theirs with conquest. At the Lord's table, spices performed miracles. They could mask the rot of old meat, disguise the taste of salt fish that had traveled too long, and turn the colorless porridge of daily life into something resembling pleasure. But more than that, they told a story. To serve spiced food was to say, I have access to the world beyond your imagination. You weren't just feeding your guests. You were showing them how far your reach extended, from your hall to the edges of the known earth. And that reach cost dearly. Venice grew rich on it. So did Genoa, Alexandria, Damascus. Every port, every caravan stop, every tax collector along the Silk Road added their invisible touch to the price of pepper. By the time it reached a London merchant, it had passed through a dozen hands, each one dusted with profit. Pepper was counted not by weight, but by grain. Tiny black beads, so valuable they were sometimes accepted as currency. A dowry might include a handful. A merchant might pay his rent with a pouch. In medieval Europe, spice wasn't just luxury. It was language. But the fascination ran deeper than taste or trade. Spices smelled like the exotic, the holy, the forbidden. They came from lands where the air itself was rumored to shimmer with heat. Monks wrote that cinnamon grew on trees guarded by dragons, and that nutmeg was harvested from paradise. No one doubted it. They didn't need proof, just the aroma. In a time when life was gray and rough and endlessly repetitive, that scent was proof enough that magic still existed somewhere, even if only in your soup. The church, naturally, had opinions. They saw spice as both divine and dangerous. To scent a room with frankincense was to honor God. To scent your body with cinnamon oil might tempt the devil. The line between holiness and vanity was thin and easily crossed. Still, monasteries imported spices too. For medicine, for ritual, for the endless catalog of herbal cures that filled their libraries. A pinch of ginger for the stomach, saffron for melancholy, clove for the breath of the dying. Most didn't work, but that hardly mattered. In a world without answers, belief was half the remedy. Meanwhile, in kitchens far below the cloisters and castles, spice was legend. Most peasants would never see pepper or cinnamon in their lifetime. They might have heard of it, might have smelled it once, wafting from the manor's feast. For them, flavor meant herbs, thyme, sage, garlic, onion, cheap, strong, and local. The kind of taste that came from patience, not trade. They didn't dream of the East. They dreamed of full bellies. But still, the rumor of spice drifted through every village like perfume from another world. They said nobles ate food so sweet it melted on the tongue, drank wine that smelled of roses, and perfumed their skin like fruit. And though no one believed it entirely, the idea itself was enough to sweeten the imagination. Spices became stories long before they became meals. Merchants told tales of islands that bled cinnamon sap, of cloves that grew from the graves of saints. In reality, most of them were just traders trying to protect their routes. The more mysterious the origin, the higher the price, and so myth became marketing, and desire became a business model. Every grain of pepper carried not just flavor but fantasy, the taste of a faraway paradise you'd never see but could briefly hold between your teeth. In noble kitchens, cooks experimented endlessly. They mixed sweet with salty, fruit with meat, wine with vinegar, sugar with saffron. To a modern palate, medieval fine dining would taste confusing, like dessert and dinner arguing on the same plate. A roast might be dusted with sugar, a fish glazed with honey, a pie filled with minced meat and raisins. They called it refinement. We might call it chaos. But the logic was simple. To control flavor was to control nature itself. To shape the world in your mouth, even as the rest of it remained wild and unpredictable. And perhaps that's what made spices so powerful. They offered a sense of control in a time when people had none. Disease, famine, weather, war, all of it came without warning or mercy. But here was something different, something deliberate, something beautiful. You could choose it, measure it, taste it. You could lift a spoon and feel for a fleeting moment like the world was yours to season. In a world ruled by rot and repetition, spices became the scent of escape. They promised something brighter, cleaner, untouched by the mud and monotony of daily life. When the streets smelled of damp straw and the air tasted faintly of smoke, the perfume of clove or cinnamon could feel almost divine. People didn't just crave taste, they craved transformation. And in the Middle Ages, nothing transformed a meal faster than the dust of faraway lands. To eat spiced food was to leave your own world for a moment. Each grain of pepper was a small act of travel, a whisper from somewhere warmer and more alive. It told you that somewhere there were oceans you'd never see, cities that never slept, markets that glittered under suns your eyes would never touch. For a brief, fragrant second, you weren't trapped in a gray winter of pottage and turnip. You were part of something vast, something beautiful, something rare enough to believe in. But faith and flavor often walked hand in hand. Spices weren't just culinary luxuries, they were spiritual instruments. The church used incense made from frankincense and myrrh in every mass, the sweet smoke rising heavenward like prayer made visible. The smell meant holiness. It meant transcendence. The same aroma that sanctified cathedrals also drifted through the homes of the rich, where cinnamon-scented candles burned beside icons of the Virgin. It blurred the line between devotion and indulgence. To the medieval mind, scent was not just pleasure, it was proof that heaven might be close enough to breathe. Apothecaries sold spices as cures for nearly everything. Ginger for the stomach, cloves for bad breath, nutmeg for melancholy, saffron for the heart. Most of it was nonsense, but comforting nonsense. The warmth of spice felt like health, and that was enough. Doctors, half theologian and half guesser, describe the body as a furnace of humors, hot, cold, wet, dry. They believed that cinnamon could heat the blood, that pepper could balance the phlegm, that cardamom might lift the soul from despair. People didn't just season their food. They seasoned themselves, one dose of hope at a time. Merchants built empires on that hope. The spice trade became a web that stretched from the ports of India to the wharfs of Venice. Caravans wound through deserts like veins of ambition, their wagons creaking under the weight of pepper and silk. Ships sailed from Alexandria and Calicut, their hulls stuffed with nutmeg, saffron, cinnamon, and rumor. Every grain that reached Europe had already crossed oceans, changed languages, and outlived men who died trying to carry it. When a cask of spice reached a European table, it wasn't just expensive, it was sacred. A taste of mortality defied, distance conquered, danger survived. Venice, perched like a glittering jewel between sea and sky, became the gatekeeper of taste. Its merchants grew so rich from the spice routes that they built palaces of marble and mirrors, reflections of all the gold they'd swallowed from the East. Every peppercorn that passed through their hands carried another tax, another story. Their ships were guarded like royal processions, their ledgers encrypted like scripture. To control spice was to control civilization's desire itself, and for centuries, Venice did. Its docks smelled of salt, silk, and ambition. The entire city seemed perfumed by greed. The obsession trickled down, as it always does. In monasteries, monks grew restless. They studied old texts, mapped vague rumors of faraway islands, traced the paths of caravans that never returned. Even scholars who'd never left their cloisters began to dream of cinnamon trees and black pepper vines, as if knowledge alone might carry them there. When pilgrims returned from the Holy Land, they brought home relics and gossip, tiny sachets of spice that could fill a church with scent for days. Every grain felt miraculous. Even the air it touched seemed touched by heaven. And yet, for all the holiness wrapped around them, spices had a darker side. They were stained with war, piracy, and the quiet cruelty of greed. Men killed for nutmeg. Empires rose and fell over cloves. Ships burned at sea for the chance to control one island's harvest. Each golden strand of saffron came from the labor of thousands, plucked flower by flower under the same sun that would one day scorch the bodies of those who carried it. No one thought much about that. Luxury rarely remembers the hands that make it. But even among the wealthy, the pursuit of spice bordered on superstition. People believed pepper could protect them from plague, that saffron could preserve youth, that nutmeg tucked in your pocket could ward off death. When the Black Death swept through Europe, some burned herbs and spices by the barrel, trying to cleanse the air of what they called corrupted humors. The smoke rose thick and fragrant, blending panic with perfume. They died anyway, but the scent must have been comforting. A small, sweet defiance in the face of something that had no mercy. For the poor, the spice craze was mostly a rumor, but it left traces even in their world. When they baked on feast days, they crushed dried herbs into their dough to mimic the flavors of the rich. A pinch of sage, a little honey, a drop of ale, alchemy for the desperate. And when the wind blew down from the manor house carrying the smell of spiced meat, They paused their work for a second, eyes closed, just breathing it in. It was the scent of distance, of a life they'd never live but could still imagine. And perhaps that imagination was the most powerful trade route of all. The scent traveled farther than ships ever could. It drifted through generations into paintings, prayers, and stories of faraway lands that glittered under endless suns. The desire for flavor became the desire for discovery. The hunger for taste became the hunger for the world itself. And before long, that hunger would spill over the edge of the known map entirely. It began, as most great journeys do, with something small, a taste, a craving. A quiet question whispered over dinner, "Where does this come from?" And from that question, ships began to rise. The medieval appetite for spice didn't just reshape kitchens, it reshaped continents. The kings who'd never cooked a meal in their lives suddenly spoke in the language of pepper and cinnamon. They drew maps of seas they'd never seen, made promises they couldn't keep, and sent men across the horizon to chase a fragrance. All for flavor, that fleeting thing that disappears the moment you taste it. By the late 15th century, Europe's geography of desire had outgrown its borders. Venice and the Islamic ports controlled the old spice roads, their tolls stacked like walls of gold. So Western monarchs, restless and hungry for profit, looked elsewhere. If they couldn't buy the route, they'd invent one. Portugal turned to the ocean, building ships that could hold months of water and prayer. Spain followed, watching the horizon like a gambler watching dice. And so began the age of maps, drawn in hope and ignorance. The first explorers weren't romantics. They were accountants. Men chasing a profit margin that smelled like cloves. Pepper, once worth its weight in silver, became the most rational reason to risk your life at sea. Every voyage began as commerce and ended as legend. A simple business transaction wrapped in the poetry of discovery. The journals of captains spoke less of wonder and more of weather, rot and balance sheets. But somewhere between the trade winds and the prayers, something else began. The quiet realization that the world was larger and hungrier than anyone had imagined. The sailors who returned brought stories thicker than their cargo. Islands where the trees bled gold. Seas that glowed in the dark. Natives who carried spice in their hair, as if scent itself was a form of currency. Half of it was lies, the other half exaggeration, but the world didn't care. Europe was addicted to myth, and the smell of cinnamon only made it stronger. Soon, the hunger grew into conquest. Portugal's ships reached India and East Africa, their sails heavy with royal ambition. Spain sailed west and stumbled into continents it hadn't asked for. The search for flavor turned into the search for empire. Pepper led to port cities, nutmeg to plantations, cinnamon to colonies. Each grain of spice left a trail of blood, salt, and ink behind it. The seas filled with ships, not just carrying goods, but carrying the weight of human greed. Sailors, slaves, merchants, missionaries, all bound by the same invisible leash, taste. Back in Europe, the results glittered. Markets overflowed with smells once reserved for kings. For the first time, even merchants and craftsmen could afford a touch of luxury, a pinch of pepper for stew, a dusting of sugar for holidays. The illusion of abundance spread faster than the wealth itself. People began to believe they were living in a golden age of flavor. They weren't. The true cost was paid far from their tables by people whose names were never written down. The church, seeing this new world unfold, tried once again to sanctify it. They blessed the ships, the merchants, the explorers. They preached that the wealth of the East was a divine reward for Christian courage. But beneath the hymns and the incense, the truth was simpler. Europe was hungry, and hunger always finds a way to disguise itself as virtue. In noble halls, spices lost their mystery. What was once sacred became expected. Pepper no longer symbolized power. It symbolized habit. The rich grew bored. They began to chase new tastes. Sugar, coffee, chocolate, tea. Each a new frontier, each with its own invisible empire of labor and longing. The cycle of craving continued, dressed in silk and scripture. But before the world drowned in sweetness, there was a moment, brief and fragile, when spice still felt miraculous. A time when the smell of cinnamon could silence a room. When a single clove could redeem a meal. When flavor itself felt like proof that life, however hard, could still surprise you. That moment didn't last, but its echo still lingers every time we eat something we can't explain. A warmth on the tongue, a memory of distant shores, a hunger older than history. And perhaps that's what the Middle Ages were really chasing. Not the spice itself, but what it represented. Escape from sameness, from survival, from the slow gray rhythm of existence. A reminder that even in a world of famine and faith, there was still wonder hiding in the smallest things. Wonder that could be bought, tasted, and briefly owned. A miracle you could sprinkle on your dinner. By the time the 15th century ended, the world no longer smelled the same. The old gray kitchens of Europe had found color again. Not from paint or light, but from taste. The air of markets and ports carried traces of cinnamon, pepper, and saffron, faint perfumes of the faraway. The miracle had become routine. What was once priceless was now simply expected. And yet, in that quiet transformation, something had been lost. The mystery faded. The wonder dulled. The scent of spice, once a whisper of paradise, became just another echo of power. The world had traded its hunger for curiosity, and curiosity for control. Kings had their colonies, merchants their wealth, and peasants their same thin stew, now flavored, occasionally, with the tiniest taste of the world beyond their reach. Still, in small kitchens tucked behind stone walls, cooks stirred their pots and inhaled the scent of spice with quiet reverence. It wasn't the cost that mattered anymore. It was the feeling, the reminder that life, even when hard, could still be softened by something beautiful. A sweetness, a just an seedness, was a padjuth, amvoy feet greeds, a but big one libel the rewan, a warmth, a flicker of gold in a gray age. And so the medieval world, having tasted paradise and priced it accordingly, began to turn inward again, toward simpler meals, toward the comfort of what was known, toward the quiet relief of a warm loaf, a soft broth, a full stomach, and the kind of peace that doesn't need to impress anyone. Because after centuries of hunger and excess, the greatest luxury of all was not spice or sugar or gold. It was the feeling of enough. When you think of comfort food, you probably imagine warmth. A bowl steaming in your hands. Something that smells faintly of safety, or memory, or love. In the Middle Ages, comfort was rarer, and yet somehow it existed. Not in luxury, not in plenty, but in the small mercies that made survival feel almost gentle. For most people, the act of eating was an act of faith. Every meal, no matter how humble, was a brief victory against a world that never stopped trying to starve you. You didn't eat because you were hungry. You ate because you were still alive. And in that way, food became a prayer. Quiet, repetitive, sincere, the rhythm of spoon to bowl, of chew and swallow, was its own kind of devotion. Picture a medieval evening near the end of winter. The fields are barren, the sky bruised with fading light. Inside a small timber house, the hearth flickers. Smoke curls toward the roof, carrying the scent of barley, leeks, and the faint sweetness of onions frying in fat. A pot hums softly over the fire. Thick, heavy, slow. Not a feast, not a famine either. Just enough. Someone stirs it without hurry, the wooden spoon worn thin from years of the same motion. Children sit close to the warmth, faces glowing, eyes half closed, with that special kind of tired that only cold months bring. There's no chatter, no laughter, no performance, only the quiet, steady sound of living. The meal will taste of smoke and salt, and maybe a memory. Last summer's carrots, a scrap of bacon traded from a neighbor, herbs dried by the window. It will be eaten from wooden bowls, shared without ceremony. And yet, it will feel sacred, because in a world that offered so little comfort, food was the one thing that could still feel like mercy. Even the poorest peasants understood this better than anyone. They didn't dream of abundance. They dreamed of constancy. A harvest that didn't fail. A loaf that rose. A pot that didn't empty too soon. Comfort to them wasn't about flavor. It was about rhythm, the small stability that made the chaos of existence tolerable. To eat what you'd eaten yesterday and what you might eat again tomorrow was to be safe, if only for an evening. Monks wrote about this in their own quiet way. In monasteries, where silence was law and fasting routine, food became the one moment of shared humanity. They ate slowly in long, echoing halls. Each monk bowed over his bowl while a reader recited scripture aloud. No one spoke. No one needed to. The meal itself was a sermon. Humility boiled into broth. It was a reminder that nourishment didn't have to be joyful to be holy. Sometimes, holiness was simply endurance. But comfort wasn't only found in eating. It was also in the ritual of kneading dough, of stirring pots, of watching a loaf rise by firelight. In a world where so little could be controlled, weather, war, death, the kitchen was one of the few places where effort produced reward. You could transform grain into bread, milk into cheese, berries into jam. Alchemy performed daily by hands that never called themselves magicians. There was peace in that, a kind of quiet authority that no lord could steal and no priest could interpret for you. Even the humblest meal carried traces of identity. Each region, each season, each household had its own rhythm of taste. Fish along the coasts, oats in the north, garlic and olive oil in the south. A stew in one village might be thickened with barley, in another with ground peas or rye. Recipes didn't belong to people, they belonged to time itself. They were shaped by soil, by trade, by accident. And yet, they bound communities more tightly than any law or scripture. To share food was to share life, and in a fragile world, that mattered more than anything. When travelers stopped at an inn, the rare kind that didn't smell of wet straw and regret, the comfort wasn't in the beds or the wine. It was in the bowl that arrived at their table, hot, heavy, and indistinguishable from the last dozen bowls they'd eaten in other towns. Every innkeeper used the same recipe because there were no recipes, just instincts. A handful of barley, whatever the day's meat offered, herbs if luck allowed. It was familiarity disguised as variety, and for those travelers, that was enough. It meant the world was still predictable in at least one small way. To us, medieval food might look bleak, dull colors, rough textures, no sugar, little spice, but to them it was comfort in its purest form, simple, slow, and certain. They didn't eat to chase pleasure. They ate to keep despair at bay. And maybe that's the secret. The modern world forgot that peace is rarely exciting. Sometimes it's just a spoon scraping the bottom of a pot, a full belly, and the sound of rain on a wooden roof. In noble houses, comfort wore different clothes but meant the same thing. After the feasts ended and the guests had gone, even lords and ladies retreated to quiet meals, porridge before bed, hot wine spiced just enough to dull the chill. They too sought gentleness after grandeur, something familiar, something human. A reminder that beneath all the gold and ceremony, they were still fragile bodies in a cold world, looking for warmth in the same old stew. And maybe that's the most striking thing about medieval comfort. It was democratic. It belonged to everyone and no one. A peasant's bowl and a noble's cup might have been worlds apart in worth, but not in meaning. Both were attempts to hold the chaos at arm's length. Both were small, fleeting acts of defiance against the cold and the dark. And both, for a moment, worked. The church often spoke of heaven as a feast, a table that never emptied, a cup that never ran dry. That image existed because people knew hunger so well. For the medieval soul, paradise wasn't gold streets or angelic choirs. It was supper that never ended, bread that never molded, warmth that never left. Heaven was dinner, made eternal. Even the act of giving food carried comfort. Almsgiving was one of the most common acts of piety. Bread handed to beggars outside a church door, stew ladled to the sick, crumbs left for the birds. In giving, people felt lighter, as if generosity itself could buy them a seat at that eternal table. The world was cruel, but kindness, like hunger, always returned. You imagine it now, a mother passing a crust to her child, a monk handing a bowl to a stranger, a lord instructing his servants to feed the poor at his gates. None of them rich in peace, but all of them grasping at it, one meal at a time. Comfort wasn't luxury, it was connection. It was the soft reminder that someone else might care whether you survived until morning. And when the food was gone, comfort lingered anyway. In the smell of the fire, in the faint sweetness on the tongue, in the knowledge that tomorrow the same simple ritual would begin again. No matter how cruel the world became, there would always be grain to grind, pots to stir, bread to break. Life, however fragile, refused to stop being ordinary. Comfort, in the medieval sense, was never a guarantee. It had to be built, moment by moment, meal by meal, like a fragile bridge over an endless uncertainty. Food was one of the few things that gave structure to time. Not clocks, not calendars, but hunger. The ringing of church bells didn't just mark the hours of prayer, it marked the hours of eating. Matins before dawn. Mass after breakfast. Vespers before supper. Faith and food side by side, like the inhale and exhale of daily life. Each season, too, brought its own rhythm of comfort. In spring, the relief of greens returning, leeks, nettles, dandelions. In summer, the joy of ripe fruit eaten fast before it spoiled. In autumn, the ritual of storing, drying, salting, pickling, hoping you'd guessed correctly how long winter would last. And in winter, the long, slow stretch of endurance. Meals that blurred together in shades of brown and gray, sustained less by flavor than by faith that warmth would eventually return. To live like that required patience, a kind of quiet surrender to the pattern of the earth. You couldn't rush the seasons, only live through them. Maybe that's why medieval comfort feels so calm to us now, because it was earned through waiting. Superstition surrounded every step of it. Before grinding the first grain of the season, millers would cross themselves, mutter blessings to the stones. When a loaf failed to rise, bakers blamed spirits in the flour or sins left unconfessed. And when the harvest was good, people didn't just celebrate, they feared it too, afraid that joy might tempt misfortune. You thanked God loudly for your full table, but never too loudly lest he hear pride in your voice and balance the scales next year. Gratitude and anxiety lived in the same breath. Even comfort was a cautious thing. In some villages, food itself was treated like a living being. The first loaf of the harvest was the loaf of the field. cut ceremoniously, blessed, and sometimes buried at the edge of the farmland to ensure next year's fertility. Leftover bread wasn't thrown away, it was crumbled for birds, or burned with prayer, never wasted. To waste food was to invite hunger. To waste comfort was to insult grace. So they kept everything. Even scraps had purpose. Even bones had worth. The modern world might call it poverty. They called it wisdom. Feasts, too, followed that logic. Comfort wasn't found in the feast itself, but in its memory, the knowledge that you'd once been full and might be again. After Christmas, after Easter, after harvest, people spoke of those meals for weeks, turning them into stories. The taste of a roast, the smell of spice, the rare sweetness of honey on bread. They relived them the way we replay music. Because when you spend most of the year surviving, even remembrance becomes a kind of luxury. Children learn comfort early. They grew up not expecting abundance, but stability. They learned to love small things: the heel of bread dipped in soup, milk warmed by the fire, the last berry of summer found hiding on the bush. Every small pleasure was counted carefully, savored completely, then let go. It taught them resilience, but also appreciation. To be medieval was to love what you had without assuming it would stay. Comfort also carried sound: the crackle of a hearth, the soft clink of spoons, the faint hum of a hymn sung without thought. The sound of people eating together filled the emptiness between prayers. In monasteries, it echoed like thunder through the stone halls. In cottages, it was barely more than a whisper. But both were sacred in their own way. Both said, "We're still here." When famine came, and it always did eventually, those sounds changed. Silence grew louder. People prayed more, spoke less, and began to dream about food instead of eating it. They talked about bread the way poets talk about love, with longing, reverence, and disbelief that something so simple could be so far away. Even hunger had its rituals. You ate slower, stretched smaller portions, boiled the same broth until it forgot its ingredients. Comfort became memory, and memory became survival. Still, people found ways to soften the edges of hunger. They made jokes about it. They carved crude faces into turnips, sang songs about empty pots, and turned suffering into theater. Humor, in its own strange way, was nourishment too. A reminder that if you could still laugh, you hadn't yet been beaten by the world. When spring finally broke through, the first good meal after famine felt like resurrection. Not joy exactly, but release, the slow return of color to a gray life. Bread baked from new grain, fresh milk, herbs green enough to make your eyes sting. That first bite tasted like forgiveness, and it always came with silence, because no one wanted to speak in the presence of something so close to grace. Even death had food woven through it. The dying were given spiced wine, broth, or milk sweetened with honey if there was any left. Mourners shared bread in the days after, a ritual called the soul loaf, meant to feed both the living and the departed. It wasn't about taste, it was about connection, the belief that comfort could cross the threshold of mortality, that even the dead somewhere might still feel full. In this way, food became the language of emotion. Joy had a flavor. So did grief. Love, friendship, sorrow, all of it passed through the same bowl, touched by the same hands. When you shared food, you shared life. When you withheld it, you declared war. Even kings understood this. A banquet could start a peace treaty or end one. A loaf of bread could make a saint. The act of feeding or not feeding was civilization itself. The strange comfort of medieval food, then, wasn't really in the food at all. It was in what it represented: endurance, faith, The promise that no matter how thin the soup or how coarse the bread, there was still something warm left in the world. Something that pushed back quietly against the cold. It's strange how easily comfort disappears once it becomes common. In the medieval world, a loaf of bread could bring tears. Today, it's just a side dish. But back then, when every meal could be your last good one for a while, gratitude lived closer to the surface. It wasn't a virtue, it was a reflex. When something warm filled your stomach, the world felt briefly aligned, like the stars had agreed to give you one more day. And people didn't waste that feeling. They built rituals around it. Before every meal came a prayer. Short, familiar, automatic. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts. The words themselves mattered less than the act of pausing to say them. It was a moment to acknowledge that eating, in this fragile world, was never guaranteed. And after the meal, another prayer, gratitude wrapped around survival, like a quiet benediction. That habit became the heartbeat of medieval comfort. Small pauses between hunger and relief, between fear and faith. We live faster now. We eat standing, scrolling, distracted. But in that distant age, meals moved at the pace of gratitude. Slow, measured, mindful, before mindfulness had a name. They didn't call it peace, they just called it supper. Even the silence carried meaning. People didn't fill it with talk. They listened to the crackle of the hearth, the breathing of their family, the soft scrape of spoons against wood. Sound had texture then. It filled space, like warmth fills the air. To share silence was to share comfort. To break it was to remind everyone that the world outside was still loud, still cruel. So they kept it, as one keeps a secret. The taste of comfort was rarely sweet. Sugar existed, but it was rarer than gold and twice as prized. Most sweetness came from honey. Sharp, floral, fleeting, it flavored feasts, but also funerals. It sealed wounds and softened goodbyes. A spoon of honey on the tongue of a dying person was considered a kindness, a final reminder that life had its sweet moments, even at the end. The taste lingered in the mouth long after the light faded, and somehow that felt right. Medieval comfort was not about indulgence. It was about endurance. It asked nothing extravagant of the world, only that the fire stayed lit, that the bread rose, that the rain came when it should. Comfort wasn't owned. It was borrowed from the moment. You learned to take it where you could find it, in food, in warmth, in the smell of earth after rain. And when it left, you didn't resent it. You just waited, because waiting was what people did best. They waited for seasons to turn, for harvest to grow, for the church bell to call them to eat. And somehow, through all the waiting, they learned a truth most of us forget, that comfort isn't something you chase. It's something that arrives quietly when you stop. You can imagine it now, a man leaning over a steaming bowl after 12 hours in the fields, hands cracked and aching, face lined from the wind. He eats slowly, not because he wants to, but because he can't rush the heat. Each bite warms him a little more. The air smells of smoke and straw. He doesn't smile, but his shoulders drop, his breath steadies. For the first time all day, his body stops fighting the world. That's comfort, not joy, not pleasure, just the moment when survival stops feeling like a battle. Even the rituals of scarcity carried tenderness. Bread was cut in silence, always with the same knife. The youngest took their portions last. When there wasn't enough, the parents pretended they'd already eaten. That quiet selflessness was as common as hunger, and just as constant. No one called it love. There wasn't time for poetry in lives this hard. But that's what it was. A love so ordinary that it became invisible, like warmth or breath. Food was memory, too. The smell of a certain herb, the sound of a bubbling pot, the texture of a crust, all of it stitched time together. A widow might stir the same soup her husband once made, long after he was gone, tasting not flavor but remembrance. A mother might whisper the same blessing her grandmother had said before the meal, even if she no longer believed in the God it named. Comfort, in that sense, was continuity, the feeling that even when people vanished, their rituals stayed. The church understood that. It used bread and wine, not just as symbols, but as anchors. The Eucharist wasn't only faith, it was familiarity. The same gestures, the same words, repeated week after week, a ritual that fed both hunger and hope. Even those who doubted the doctrine found peace in the pattern. Because pattern, more than promise, is what people crave when the world keeps changing. Outside the churches, taverns carried their own kind of holiness. Rough, smoky, noisy, and yet deeply human. Men gathered with tankards of ale. Women traded gossip. Travelers thawed by the fire. Laughter rose, sometimes arguments too, but beneath it all was belonging. The ale was weak, the food forgettable, but the comfort was real. You were warm, you were not alone. And for one evening, that was enough. It's easy to romanticize that world. The flickering firelight, the slow rhythm, the quiet gratitude, but comfort, even then, had its price. The warmth came from wood. Someone had to chop. The bread came from grains someone had to grind. Every ease was earned through exhaustion. The peace of the evening was balanced on the ache of the day. Maybe that's why it felt so precious. Because you couldn't take it for granted. Not once, not ever. And yet, across centuries, that same feeling survives. We still gather around warmth. We still eat to remember, to connect, to pause. The ingredients have changed, but the need hasn't. Every time you pour a drink for a friend, or cook when you could have ordered, or sit quietly after a meal instead of rushing away, you're echoing something ancient, something older than comfort food, something closer to gratitude. After supper, the world went quiet. The sound of eating faded, replaced by the softer rhythm of settling, the scraping of bowls, the sigh of the fire, the heavy creak of wood as people shifted on benches worn smooth by years of the same movements. There were no clocks, no television, no hum of machines to fill the air. Only breath, the occasional cough, and the low murmur of someone offering thanks under their breath. The stillness after a meal wasn't emptiness. It was relief. The brief golden pause before another day began again. In the smallest huts, families slept where they ate. The fire burned low through the night, its glow a heartbeat against the dark. Smoke drifted lazily up through the roof beams, curling into the chill. The pot from supper still hung over the embers, a thin crust of broth clinging to its sides. It would be scraped into tomorrow's meal. No waste, no forgetting. The smell lingered. Onions, ash, and comfort. It wrapped the sleepers like a blanket. Outside, the village was hushed. The animals had gone still, their warmth trapped beneath thatch and straw. Snow sometimes fell without sound, frosting the rooftops, softening everything it touched. The world, for a few hours, felt almost kind. Even the air seemed to hesitate, too cold to move, too tired to bite. And within that stillness, comfort took its truest form, not in feasts, not in flavor, but in the quiet knowledge that you had eaten, that the fire was still alive, that nothing terrible waited just beyond the door. The church encouraged such moments of peace, though not for the same reasons. They called it Vesper Calm, the hour between labor and prayer when the body was full and the soul more willing to listen. Monks often wrote of that hour as the purest kind of contemplation. Your stomach warm, your heart slow, Your mind open, even peasants, though they didn't call it by any holy name, felt the same softness settle over them. It was the only time of day that truly belonged to them. Not the Lord, not the church, not the weather. Just them and the fire and the slow drift of sleep. In some places, families told stories during that hour. Tales of saints and miracles, of witches and wandering spirits, of lost travelers guided home by starlight. The children listened with heavy eyes, faces lit by the fire's last flicker. The adults spoke in measured tones, their words part lullaby, part memory. Storytelling was as essential as bread. It filled the space that hunger once occupied. It reminded people that, though life was short and often cruel, it still contained wonder, small, flickering, and worth keeping alive. The poor and the wealthy alike had their rituals of ending the day. In castles, servants cleared the remains of the feast while nobles drank warm wine by candlelight. In taverns, the ale cooled and the laughter softened. Even laughter had a curfew. Night was respected, almost feared, not for its darkness, but for its power to quiet everything that mattered. The last sound before sleep was often the crackle of the hearth. For many, that sound was prayer enough. Rest itself was not a luxury, but a fragile truce. The body didn't sleep so much as recover. The day's hunger and work sat heavy in the limbs, but warmth eased it. Sleep came in layers, shallow and deep, broken and reclaimed. You didn't expect peace to last. You took it where it offered itself, like a visitor who might not return. Even dreams were practical. People dreamed of fields, of rain, of food, rarely of joy. Joy was for waking, dreams were for hope. Sometimes, just before the fire died, someone would stir and add another log. A small gesture, barely awake but deeply human. A promise to the others sleeping nearby. The warmth will still be here when you wake. And for a while, that promise was enough to keep the cold out. If you could walk through a medieval village at night quietly unseen, you'd find hundreds of such small comforts glowing behind shutters. A single candle still burning, a pot still warm, a half-eaten crust left for the morning. Proof that even in an age of hardship, people had found ways to be gentle with life. They didn't need much. Just a meal, a fire, and someone to share it with. Everything else was survival. This was living. And in that silence you can almost hear it. The steady rhythm of breath, the slow pulse of warmth through stone walls, the faint hiss of the last ember turning to ash. The night stretches long, but not unkind. Tomorrow will bring work, hunger, worry. But for now, for this fragile borrowed moment, the world is enough. By morning, the fire is nearly gone. Only a few coals survive, glowing like buried stars under a blanket of gray ash. The room smells faintly of smoke, wool, and sleep. The fragrance of survival. Someone stirs first. The same someone who always does. They move carefully, quietly, not to wake the others. The air bites. The floor is cold. The first breath of dawn feels raw in the chest. But that's how the day begins. Not with sunlight, but with obligation. Before food, there's work. Water to fetch, animals to feed, ashes to sweep. The rhythm is ancient, older than the buildings, older than the names of the saints carved into the church door. Hunger walks beside you through all of it, patient and familiar. The promise of breakfast keeps your hands steady and your thoughts slow. When the fire catches again, the smell of smoke rises, thin and silver. A pot is set over the embers. The same pot, the same recipe, the same prayer. Grain, water, a pinch of salt, if fortune allows. The spoon turns slowly, steady as breathing. Steam curls upward, softening the air. The light through the shutter is still weak, pale as milk. You could be in any century. The sound of boiling water hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Breakfast isn't indulgence, it's reassurance. It tells you that yesterday didn't take everything from you. It means the fire didn't die, the grain didn't run out, the world still functions in its small, dependable way. You eat not for pleasure, but to remind yourself that life continues, even when joy doesn't. The bowl is rough in your hands. The first bite burns your tongue. The second feels safe. Outside, the frost still clings to the grass. The church bell tolls, calling people to prayer before the fields. Its sound rolls through the village like a slow heartbeat, stirring roofs and doorways awake. Dogs bark, roosters call, children mumble, complaints that sound the same in every century. The air smells of damp wood and smoke. Life begins again, exactly where it left off. For most, the meal is brief. A few mouthfuls of pottage, a crust of bread. If you're lucky, a smear of fat or honey. If you're not, just broth and prayer. No one lingers. Comfort is something to be earned again by nightfall. The day will take it from you, through labor, through weather, through endless repetition, but the memory of warmth stays like a small ember carried inside the body. That memory is enough to make the hours bearable. In monasteries, the rhythm is slower, but no less strict. Monks rise before sunrise, their breath misting in the cloisters. The first meal comes after prayer, bread, sometimes fruit, sometimes nothing. They eat in silence, the scrape of wood on wood echoing against cold stone. Every swallow feels deliberate, almost meditative. Food is not for pleasure here, it's for clarity. They believe hunger sharpens the soul, that too much comfort dulls it. Perhaps they're right, or perhaps they just needed to believe that suffering meant something. Elsewhere, in manor kitchens, servants hurry to prepare the day's bread. The dough is heavy, sticky with yesterday's starter. They work it rhythmically, folding, pressing, turning, not because they enjoy it, but because it's necessary. The smell of yeast fills the room, sharp and warm. For a moment, even exhaustion feels fragrant. In another corner, someone churns butter. The sound is steady, hypnotic, small domestic music, the kind that never makes it into history books but builds civilizations quietly, one creak at a time. By mid-morning, the village is awake. Smoke rises from chimneys, blurring the sky into shades of blue and gray. You can tell the wealth of a household by the thickness of its smoke. Thin smoke means thin stew. Thick smoke means something is cooking that might actually taste good. The smell of bread mingles with manure, hay, and humanity. It isn't pleasant, but it's familiar. And familiarity, in this world, is comfort's twin. Children gather the first scraps of light. They run barefoot through the mud, chasing each other toward the well. Their laughter is brief but real. Even in a life this narrow, joy still finds cracks to grow through. Someone calls them back inside, their names carried over frost. The door shuts, the noise fades, the rhythm continues. The world hums with purpose, rough, uneven, steady. Inside every home, the same small acts repeat. The bread divided, the bowl filled, the prayer whispered. Tiny rituals performed without thought that kept people tethered to existence. It was never about taste. It was about continuity, the invisible comfort of knowing what comes next. Even in hardship, that routine gave meaning. When famine struck, when plague swept through, when neighbors vanished without goodbye, the act of preparing food continued. A fire was lit. A pot was filled. Not because hope was strong, but because habit was stronger. And sometimes Habit was enough. If you lived then, you would measure your days not in hours, but in meals, not in wealth, but in warmth. Your body would remember comfort the way we remember songs, by rhythm, not by reason. And though you'd never call it happiness, you'd recognize its shape in the simplest of things. A bowl held between your hands, a roof that doesn't leak, the sound of someone breathing beside you. The Middle Ages were brutal, yes, but they were also tender, in the quiet ways that never make it into textbooks. A husband sharing his last crust, a mother saving the sweeter piece of fruit for her child, a stranger leaving a loaf on a doorstep without saying who it came from. These were their luxuries, unwritten, unrecorded, unending. The comfort of being cared for, even a little, in a world that owed you nothing. Perhaps that's what we've forgotten. That comfort doesn't need to impress you. It doesn't have to be earned or displayed or shared online. It just has to exist, quietly, somewhere between the warmth of food and the gentleness of time. The day will end the same way it always does, with smoke rising from the hearth and the faint smell of bread cooling on a wooden board. A few bowls will be set aside for tomorrow, and the rest will vanish before the sun does. The fire will dim, the light will fade, and the world, as it always has, will grow quiet again. That's how comfort lived in the Middle Ages, not in feasts or fortune, but in the rhythm of enough. Enough warmth, enough food, enough time to rest before the cold returned. Each day was its own small promise that life, however hard, could still be kind in its own plain way. A loaf rising in the dark, a pot humming on the hearth, a moment of stillness shared between exhaustion and peace. And when the bells rang at night, slow, heavy, familiar people didn't pray for wealth or glory or even change. They prayed for the same thing they'd prayed for yesterday. A meal that didn't run out, a fire that didn't die, a morning that still came. Centuries later, the recipes have changed, but the need hasn't. We still chase that same quiet comfort, the warmth of a kitchen, the sound of someone stirring beside us, the peace that comes from knowing, for now, that we are safe. Every bite of food, every moment of rest, still carries the echo of those who once prayed for less and received enough. Their comfort lives on in ours. And as the fire softens to ash, the air settles again, calm, slow, endless. Outside, the fields sleep beneath the frost. Inside, the last candle trembles, then steadies. The world exhales. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the quiet heartbeat of 1,000 forgotten kitchens, still feeding the living, one breath at a time. And that's where we'll leave the medieval world tonight. Somewhere between hunger and hope, between the smell of smoke and the sound of rest. You've walked through fields that never stopped growing, sat beside fires that never truly went out, and listened to the slow heartbeat of lives lived, one meal at a time. They never had our comfort, but somehow they built something softer, a kind of peace that didn't need perfection to exist. If you're still awake, let your thoughts wander there for a moment. For a moment, to the rhythm of the pot on the hearth, to the faint murmur of voices fading into sleep, to that fragile, familiar warmth that asks for nothing but quiet. You can almost smell the bread again, hear the bell in the distance, feel the night leaning gently against the walls of every small home that ever stood against the dark. The same moon they saw still hangs above you now. The same stars. The same sky. The same steady silence that has always waited for the world to rest. So breathe. Let the noise of the day drift away, like smoke from a dying fire. You don't need to do anything else. You don't need to go anywhere. You've arrived. Good night, and thank you for listening.